Hello, and welcome to another bonus live stream from the Save Your Sanity podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoberta Shaler, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Sharon Sayler. And we have done a show before on my Emotional Savvy podcast. You can go and listen to that. And we're going to be talking about this very important topic of overcoming the effects of toxic relationships on your immune system, because you may not even realize how the immune system is being affected by the chronic stress, the chronic tension, the chronic anxiety. And that's sure all part of being in a toxic relationship. So thank you for joining me, Sharon.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's so fun to always be with you.
Well, it is fun. It's fun to have people around that I know well, and we can talk about things. And for people who'd like to know more about Sharon, although she's going to tell you a few things in a minute, you can always go to sharonsayler.com and you can learn all about her messaging and how she can help you, particularly in the business world. So that's a fun thing to do. So this interest in autoimmune things, how did you come to it?
Well, as a patient, unfortunately, I really hadn't paid much attention to the topic at all until 7 years ago, when out of the blue, I was on a business trip and I woke up one morning. I flew in, got in about midnight, woke up early in the morning, and I couldn't move my legs. Terrifying that I've got a job to do in a few hours. And I finally got the legs to move, but they just felt like jello. And I did go and muscle through like a lot of us do. You know, I'd been hired to be there and I'd flown in for the event and muscled through. Yet, but as the day progressed, something wasn't right. But I didn't know what it possibly could be. And then it just seemed to dissipate. I was like, okay, well, and I was going to stay down with friends and enjoy where I had flown into. And so it was over Memorial Weekend. We were driving across town, across a large, about 3-hour drive. And I noticed that my arm started to get a rash, but I kept thinking, oh, well, you know, that's the arm that's been near the window in the sun. And I'm rationalizing all these things going on. And in the next 24 hours, I had a rash from the top of my knees all the way into my scalp. And of course, that was a big red warning flag. And went to an urgent care there. And they immediately said, you know, I think you need to go to your medical care. You're not contagious. And they said they weren't sure what it was, but they were sure it was hives. And went to medical care. And lo and behold, it turned out to be an autoimmune condition, a very rare one called dermatomyositis. Dermato meaning skin, myositis meaning muscle weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. It's your world. All of a sudden, everything.
Yeah, that's the proverbial hit up the side of the head with a universal 2x4, isn't it?
It was. Yeah. And, you know, though I really see the silver lining in it 7 years looking back. If you had asked me 7 years ago, I was having trouble seeing silver linings. But now looking back, I would have started the AutoImmune Hour, for sure. But part of me was having such struggle getting doctors to pay attention, getting the information I was wanting. I started the AutoImmune Hour to get that information because I knew if I'm struggling to find it with all of my communication and business background, what is someone without my training going through? So that's why I started the AutoImmune Hour, was to meld my business savvy and my communication skills with helping people understand, get information about the autoimmune condition, all types of autoimmune conditions. There's hundreds of them and more every day they're finding out. The immune system is so complex and not one person manifests the same. If you said to me, I also have dermatomyositis, we would manifest it differently. And so it's really tough to sometimes diagnose.
I think many of them are. You know, back in the day when people started getting what came to be known as fibromyalgia, you know, it was, oh, it's all in your head. These are silly things. You're making it all up. You want attention. And even doctors, you know, they just didn't have a word for it. They didn't understand. You know, that's going back quite a while. And some of these things, they mimic other things. They are, like you said, well, I can make up a justification for it. I have my arm out the window. Okay, well, what do you have to say about the other arm? Oh, I don't know.
Exactly. It was getting the shade. It was getting the sun from the back. Or you can always come up with rationalizations when you don't know for sure.
But I have many clients who are getting in or wanting to get out or getting out of toxic relationships. And so many of them have Epstein-Barr, fibromyalgia, or a variety of autoimmune situations, a lot of inflammation-based things. And of course, that makes sense. If you're in a toxic relationship, you're constantly being triggered. There's always tension. There's always stress. There's always getting your exercise by walking on eggshells. And so your body is just always at a level that your amygdala is going alert, 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 alert. And your body is trying to respond. How do I need to be on alert? What do I need to be looking out for? And we get into this situation. Now, I'm not a medical doctor. You're not a medical doctor, but you've been talking to medical doctors for a whole lot of years.
Over 250.
Yeah. And on your show, you talked to medical doctors. I was going to medical school before I switched into psychology. So I've always had a big interest in that. And it's important for us to know the body-mind connection, isn't it?
Absolutely. And more research is coming out every day. There's some favorites that I like to watch is like Dr. Bessel van de Kolk and Stephen Porges are just some of the big names in the field, as well as many others, talk about past traumas. And maybe you're not in a toxic relationship right now, but maybe your childhood was toxic, or your teen years, or you were and you escaped. It doesn't have to be that the autoimmune happens while you're in the relationship.
Right.
It can come from your childhood. And there's an interesting study that was done out of Iceland. And now this is a comparative study. So, we take those with what they are, but I still found the numbers interesting because they researched 106,000 people that had stress disorders and more than 1 million people that didn't have stress disorders. And they found that you had a 36% greater risk of developing one of 41 autoimmune diseases. And like I said, there's hundreds of them. So they were just looking at the big ones like MS, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, those types of things. But they found that you had a 36% greater risk of getting an autoimmune disease if you had a stress disorder and trauma in your past. 36%. Right. Wow. That's over a third.
Yes. I mean, this is real. And that's a great study to cite, Sharon. And I'm glad you did, because don't ever dismiss stress as a cause for further investigation of your physical discomfort, because it is constantly putting your body on edge. It's constantly using up energy for being on edge that you need to restore your body and you need to take care of your body. And it interrupts your sleep. So then the time that's supposed to be restoring your organs and allowing things to rest and refurbish is not there because you are like someone who just drank a whole pot of coffee. You're on edge. You're watching over the. I think about some of my clients, and they'll say, well, I have to keep one eye out because my partner comes home late at night and maybe has been drinking too much and starts to look for something I missed to do in the kitchen. And so they'll have one ear open at all times, like, is it okay? I mean, the body is on, is there anything to find? This particular client was meticulous about keeping the house because her partner was always looking for something to be angry about. There was nothing to find, but she was still thinking, well, he will find something. Yes, he will find something, because if there's nothing to find in the kitchen, he will find something somewhere because he is dedicated to getting angry. So there she is, not sleeping, resting on eggshells, and wide awake, really on edge, wondering, listening, listening, listening. And that takes a toll on the body.
Oh, and one of the things I found fascinating, as I'm sure you've seen with your clients, is even when they're out of that situation and say in a new relationship, those antennae are still waiting for the shoe to drop. Or, we had a wonderful guest, Sarah Payton, on, and she talks a lot about the neurobiology of us. So she's an expert in nonviolent communication as well. And she talks a lot about how we talk to ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves. And she's got a wonderful word that she's coined, and it's called alarmed aloneness. And she puts that in between fight, flight, or freeze and comfort. That some people, if you've been through traumas and maybe you've escaped, you're not in them now, but there's always this sort of state of alarm and feeling alone because you're waiting for the next person to come and betray you or to do something, create a situation where it's toxic. And it's interesting to me how when we talk about this, it's these radars that are out there in our head going, am I safe? Do I matter? And then based on our past, it's like, oh, that person's like this person, I better be cautious. All these kinds of things that happen to us that we're not even aware that our brain is asking all those questions.
Well, and also to add to that, because I absolutely agree, but we also take into account brain development. The things that went into our brain in the first 6 years of life before we had parietal and prefrontal lobe functioning well, those things went in at an emotional level before we had language.
Mm-hmm.
So retrieving those is something that most people don't do until they get into some really difficult situation. And then, people like me go back and help them find those things. But those things get installed in there. And so just like you were saying, the expectations of those things, you turn into a bit of a meerkat. If you've been in a family like that, you're just looking at the horizon all the time, like who's coming, what's happening, am I safe? And that takes a toll on you because this chronic stress, low-level chronic stress with a few peaks of high-level stress and anxiety, very, very difficult. And again, the same thing is true. It includes chronic anxiety, which is also what we're talking about. And they're very similar, of course, stress, tension, and anxiety in what they do to the body, because as you mentioned, it's all related to the fight or flight or faint or freeze, or living in alarmed aloneness. I love that. Where we're just hypervigilant. And
Hypervigilant is so interesting to me because a lot of things about autoimmune, the doctors will poo-poo. Like you have headaches, or one of the things, like there are several autoimmunes where the pain floats. Like one day you'll wake up and, oh, my knee, it's swollen. And then that will go away a couple of days later. Oh gosh, my shoulder. And there's all, the medical professional can't pin it down. They can't put it in a nice little box. And so they label things like anxiety or stress problems, these types of things. And I find that sometimes I have discussions with medical professionals. Have you ever considered what I call situational anxiety? Because I've seen a lot of high functioning people, they can get out there, and I work a lot with speakers, and they can get out there and talk to thousands of people and they have no anxiety. But about certain health issues that they have, of course they have anxiety because they're not getting the help, the support, the safety they need, and they don't feel like they matter to anybody, especially in the medical profession.
Oh, I absolutely agree, because to have somebody who will actually open their eyes, and when you say, these things go on, and they see the emotional connection, they start asking you questions about your life, either your current life or your past life or your relationships. If a medical professional asks those questions, go with it, because this person is now saying, oh, I'm going to look for an emotional connection. And that's very important for all of us, because, I wrote a book a long time ago. I've written so many, but a long time ago, 2002 or 3 or something. And it is called What You Pay Attention to Expands. And it was long before the law of attraction and everything was popular. And so I wrote this book because when you are in that alarmed aloneness that Sarah talks about, and when you are just simply alone and you hear noises in the middle of the night or something happens, you then start constructing a story that you are going to pay attention to. And if you construct a story that says, oh, do I need to get up and check everything? Oh, that's terrible. What happens in this neighborhood? And you start going down the fear and stress one, you're going to get a different result than if you lie there and say, oh, I've heard those noises before. There's an animal on the roof, or that's the neighbor's dog, or I'm sure everything is fine. Yeah, sure, get up and check once if you need to, but then rest assured that you can turn your mind other places. But it's very important for us to realize that what we pay attention to expands. If we get into fear, the fear is going to get bigger. If we get into I'm going to sleep now, the possibility of going to sleep now is going to improve. And we have a lot of power where we place our attention. And yes, and it affects what goes on in our body, which is, of course, why meditation helps, why relaxation helps, why all those things help, right?
Yeah, as well as self-talk. I mean, we can talk. Some people say, "Oh, I can't meditate, Sharon." I said, well, talk well of yourself or journal. I'm a big fan of journaling as well, because the things that, as you said, the things we think about and talk about expand, and how we talk about ourselves. Just the old phrase, "They're a pain in the neck." Well, gosh, maybe you've got a stiff neck or something like that. I mean, think about how we talk about things is critically important. And the more we can talk about finding the right medical team. Right now, I have an amazing medical team, and it's not just one professional, it's a team. And because not everyone can specialize in everything. And that's, to me, finding these great medical teams. And just a quick story on one particular professional I chose recently was I was looking for a new one. The other one retired. And I was interviewing her, and I noticed some of the questions she was asking me were very unique. I'm like, well, this isn't a typical medical question. I was happy to answer them, but they weren't typical medical questions. Finally, I said, can I ask you a question? She said, sure. I said, do you have, or do anyone you know have autoimmune? And she says, well, yes, I do. And all of a sudden, I just felt this wash over my body of, oh, somebody gets me. Somebody will not, poo-poo this or that, or they'll listen and understand that autoimmune manifests differently for everyone. Now, fibromyalgia is not technically an autoimmune, but it sure manifests like one. And that's one where for decades, people suffered in silence because they didn't want to think they had a mental illness when it's proven
Yeah, they were
Yeah.
And that happens in a lot of medical cases. People are ashamed. They're told, oh, it's all in your head, or you're making that up to get attention. And in fact, one of our listeners just posted this. She said, Ekaterina, she said, victims of abuse play a game with the doctors. Guess what I have? This is a perfectly scheme of being constantly treated. Yeah, that's exactly right. To get attention, you can go back and back and back, and nobody gets it right.
Right. But I wanted to understand that there's two sides to that statement, the duality of, yes, people are suffering, and yes, there are other people who do it for attention. And I think that's what we have to be very cautious about, that there are people that are really suffering, and whether the pain is started from trauma, so we'll say started from some abuse types of trauma, not physical trauma, but mental, emotional trauma, and then manifested because of inflammation within the body and pain response within the body, the body begins to overreact, then it truly is a medical problem as well. So
Yes.
I don't want to diminish this idea that it's somebody is gaming the system to get attention, because yes, that does happen. We can't deny that. But we then don't want to deny a huge portion of the population that are suffering in silence because they're afraid to be labeled that.
Yes, really good point, Sharon. And I think another thing that spun off of Ekaterina's thing is that a victim of abuse maybe not be able to pinpoint what's going on either.
Mhm.
Like, I don't feel well. I feel generally awful. I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach. Then I get a headache. Then I have a ringing in my ears. Then I feel exhausted. I don't feel like getting up. All of these things happen, and they sound very physical, and they are very physical. But if people don't look to the emotional cause, then you can run around and end up with a drawer full of medication and still feel the same way. And that's also a problem, because many people don't want to believe they're being abused.
Absolutely. Or they were abused in the past. We talk about being abused in the present, but many people don't want to believe they came from an abusive family or even just a family member, because oftentimes they're still having to or trying to have a relationship within that family, or they don't want to blow the family apart. There's so many types, different corners that we can talk from that create a very, I think it's an interesting and important conversation to have, but we have to keep a very open mind about all the different drivers for how our body reacts, because it's one system, the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical. It all plays a part.
And it's all connected again. And, I had an example yesterday where, of course, the past plays a part. It plays a part in toxic relationships, particularly because if you don't recognize that you had a toxic situation when you were in your growing up years, you don't recognize that, you will unwittingly end up in almost all cases in a toxic relationship when you choose a romantic partner, because it is so familiar
Mm-hmm.
that
And you
even
may
as
not even know it's toxic. That's the scary thing. You may think
that's
it's
right.
normal.
Well, yes, and of course, toxic people, my term for them is hijackals, but toxic hijackals, they do a love bombing thing where they seem to be everything you ever wanted and more in the beginning. They read you like a book, and they give you everything they can, so that, I wrote about this in Escaping the Hijackal Trap, that the gotcha factor is a really big deal. How quickly can I get you to the gotcha? And then I can drop my persona. I can drop all this niceness. I can drop pretending to care. And I can maybe slowly and sometimes very quickly just diminish into, all right, now I have that slot filled. I have partner filled. And so now I can just go do what I want. And then I will begin degrading and belittling and demeaning and devaluing the other person. And that familiarity, like, oh, I don't like it, but it's familiar. And you don't even have those actual thoughts. It's just emotional because it got installed there when you were young. And
Mm-hmm.
so you don't know it's there. And I had a client yesterday, and it was the first time I'd seen these people, a couple that I was working with. And as the fellow told me his story, he was telling me about 20 years ago when he felt very, very depressed. And I said to him, well, how did you handle and manage the depression? He said, I buried myself in work. And Sharon, I went, really? Now you just told me a story about how you weren't really present in the first week of your son's life, or present for your wife going through a difficult birth situation, because you were buried in your work. Has it occurred to you that you're still depressed? And his face, his body, everything just like somebody let the air out.
Mm. Wow. Yes.
Now, living with that and not recognizing that is a very quick example of what you were talking about, that here is 20 years of thinking I used to be depressed, and not connecting the fact that I covered up by being a workaholic. I'm still a workaholic, so I don't even know if I'm still depressed. And the actual fact is he had symptoms of still being depressed.
It's
So,
very common in autoimmune conditions as well, where people will say that I'm in remission from XYZ, but then they're still having other issues that are pointing to inflammation or pointing to other types of joint damage or things like that. And oftentimes they'll resort to, when they're feeling that way, I don't want that to come back. And so tend to overreact or do something like emotional eating or some sort of other types of things that are not in their best interest that can really begin to exacerbate and cause a lot of people who have one autoimmune don't have more than one. You know, it's an interesting thing that I've noticed that they get through one and it morphs into something else unless they begin to discuss the entire physical, mental, emotional, spiritual part of yourself and see it as the system. We have to repair the whole system, not just put medications or nutrition, exercise. Those are all worthwhile. But if we just address the physical part of an autoimmune or stress disorder, it will never be fixed.
No, I agree with you. And we will never reduce inflammation because our story is sort of like burning on the back burner. And that's something that is just like running under the radar at all times. And we go back and we touch it and our stress grows or some occurrence happens. And then we have what we call a flare up, right?
Right.
And we've touched that back burner flame. And now we have a flare up that's in the present moment. And toxic relationships are inflammatory. You know, they're always trying to blow you up. They're always trying to put you down, wear you down, tear you down, and blow you up, which is, can I make you angry? Can I have power over you? Can I make you upset? Can I make you cry? Can I do these things to you that will put you in a state of feeling I have power over you and you are powerless? And that is an incredible hotbed of inflammation building, because
if you're powerless, how are you going to be well enough, centered enough to heal? It takes some personal power to begin to take the steps to heal too. It's an amazing trap that catches a lot of people.
Well, there's another analogy that goes with it. You know, sometimes someone will come to me, they're just dancing on their last nerve, you know, and they will say, I just need out of here. And I don't care if I don't get anything. I'll just walk out with my shirt on my back, right? Male or female, they'll say that. And I will say, oh no, let's not do that. No, I just can't do it anymore. They're right on the edge. And so then I talk them down from the edge, back from the edge, and say, wouldn't it be better if there's no sexual or physical abuse going on? Wouldn't it be better to become personally empowered, then make the decision, and then leave in a much better condition? Because you don't want to end up, and this, I usually say this to them, you don't want to end up in some studio apartment with 3 kids and 2 dogs and no money, totally disempowered, totally run down, totally torn down, totally worn down, and then sit and look around and go, now what am I going to do? You know, we can all lift ourselves up. There are all ways that we can restore ourselves. And getting some help to do that is really important because you deserve to do that. You know, I work with people all the time in these situations, whether they're just recognizing they're in a toxic relationship, or they're in the question of should I stay or should I leave, or they know for sure they want to leave and they need me to usher them through the process in the healthiest and most beneficial way for themselves and their children. And that's always available to people. And you're always available to people too. So, you know, if you're hearing what Sharon's saying and you want to hear more, what is the URL for your show?
Understandingautoimmune.com.
Okay, well, let's
Sharon Sayler.com is for my work in the communications field. I'm known as the difficult people whisperer. And so I deal with workplace conflicts, group dynamics, interesting conversations, crisis communication, those tough talk times. So it really keeps me on my toes, but it's a very interesting topic to work with.
Oh, it is. That's what I used to do. When I was on the road as a speaker, I dealt with conflict in the workplace. So I understand completely. So there you go.
Unfortunately, it's there's always work in that field, unfortunately.
That's right. It's
One of
never
the
going.
things I wanted to quickly share that I felt was useful for me was journaling. That helped me get clear with my medical professionals as well, whether it was the spiritual professionals or a mental health worker or the physical body, a medical worker. It really helped because in journaling, I write on the right-hand side of the page. And then what I do is leave the left side blank. And then as I write down everything, and then a few weeks, months, doesn't really matter. The person who taught me this had a schedule. He did it every month. But he goes back and he reads the right-hand page. And then he writes on the left-hand side what's changed.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's just wonderful because a couple of things happened when I started doing that. Is I realized that this too shall pass, everything changes, and I also got to see what worked and what didn't work. And that was really helpful for my team to see, like, okay, when we did XYZ, that really worked. And sometimes when we get healthy, we forget, we start going, oh, I can cheat today.
Oh, yes.
I like to be able to reflect back to that journal. Oh, when I was doing XYZ, I was doing much better than I am now. So that's just my tip.
Oh, absolutely. I used to own a holistic health and yoga center, and I had my private practice there. And about 70% of my practice at that time were people who had life-threatening diagnoses in their families. And so we would work through all of those things that you mentioned, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the mental, all of the aspects of health. And most of them got well if they wanted to. The original question I would always ask them, which direction are you planning to go? Are you ready to leave or do you want to stay? Because that changes entirely the direction of our work together. But if their answer was, I want to stay, then we would work, and most of them got well. And they would come back for their 6-month or their 12-month checkup. And I would say, well, you were doing this, you were doing this, you were doing this, and it worked so well. How are you doing in these areas? Oh, I don't do that anymore. Well, what do you think will happen if you weren't doing it and you got sick, you did do it and you got well, now you're not doing it? What do you think is the next logical step?
We're back to rationalization right now.
That's right. It's just my arm out the window.
Exactly. It's funny how we do full circle here, Rhoberta.
Well, I'm just so glad you would stop and talk to me today, Sharon. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you. I always enjoy it.
I've been talking with Sharon Sayler. You can find her if you're interested in her work in conflict management and difficult conversations at sharonsayler.com. If you'd like to go and hear her podcast, which is all about autoimmune things like we have been discussing today, you can find her at Understanding Autoimmune. And if you want to come and play with me, you can do that at forrelationshiphelp.com. And For Relationship Help also is the name of my YouTube channel. And there are over 500 videos there. So you may find something that answers a question for you. I do these Facebook Lives with guests that I've had on my Emotional Savvy and Save Your Sanity podcasts. Just go to the website forrelationshiphelp.com and click on podcasts. You can listen to all the episodes there, or you can get them where you prefer to find your podcasts every single day. And just before we go, Ekaterina has added something to our conversation. Children of narcissistic mothers have a tendency to find a second mother in the female doctor, to be psychologically adopted by this doctor, and the body will always have a reason to visit the doctor. Well, that's a very interesting take, isn't it?
It is. I hadn't considered that. I think that's an entirely different show.
We're going to have to really think about that, Ekaterina. Thank you so much for stimulating our thought. And so that's it for today, folks. And as I remind you every time on Save Your Sanity, until we talk again, treat yourself very, very well because you're precious and you matter. Talk soon.